Good morning and welcome from Berlin and Brighton to the webinar on our up-to-date analysis of the electricity transition in the European power sector in 2018. This webinar is based on a joint study by Sandbag and Agora Energiewende that we published on the 30th of January. In the study we are describing the state of play of the European energy transition in the power sector. It is the fourth time that we publish this type of report, and the third time we are doing it in collaboration between Sandbag and Agora Energiewende. One of the points that is setting this report apart from others out there is that we are describing the state of the European energy transition almost in real time, whereas statistical offices usually are reporting consolidated data with a time lag to 1.5 or 2 years. For this webinar, I'm joined by the two main authors of the report, Dave Jones from Sandbag.
Good morning.
You can see him on your screen. And my colleague Ali Sakhel, who is an associate for energy statistics and scenarios with Agora in Berlin. Agora is a think tank based in Berlin with activities in Brussels and some member states, increasingly also outside of Europe. Sandbag is one of the leading climate and energy transition think tanks based in Brussels and Berlin. My name is Matthias. I'm directing the European energy policy work at Agora and will facilitate this webinar together with Alice sitting next to me. I might also add one or the other political context reflection. Now, the presentation by Alice and Dave will last about 20 to 25 minutes. Before they begin, a few words on technicalities and logistics and how you can contribute to the discussion later on. First, all the information of this webinar can be found on our websites. This is the study, the European power sector in 2018. The full set of data pulled together for the study and that constitutes the basis for all the graphs and figures you find in the report. We will also put this webinar presentation on the website, and there will be a recording also on our YouTube channel. Now you can already download the presentation slides from the webinar software. A pointer should now appear on your screen, just checking whether I can see it. And yes, I can see it. And it is indicating where you can download the slides. Also now a little chat window should open up on your screen. Let me see. There it is. And if you have a question on the presentation, you can send us your questions in real time. We will address these questions, we collect them, and then address them in the Q&A part of this webinar after we first have gone through the presentation. If you pose a question, this question only appears on our screen. The other webinar participants will not see it. So when replying to your question, we will restate the question so everybody knows what has been asked and then try to answer. If you would please be so kind to mention your name and affiliation when you ask a question. We try to cover as many questions during the session as possible, and some that we might not be able to take up, we will reply to by email afterwards. You can also use the chat window if there's a technical issue or some remarks that you want to post to our colleagues supporting the technicalities of the session. If you're experiencing problems with the software, and our colleague Nicola Bock, who is sitting hidden for you, but next to us, she will try to help as far as possible. So thanks to you, Nicola, for that support. Let's get started. Dave and Alice, over to you with the presentation.
Thank you, Matthias. So I will get started and present you the main findings of our study. Can we go to the next slide? before I hand over to Dave, so I will just quickly present you the key findings of our study. So first of all, the CO2 emissions in the power sector fell by 5% in 2018. Most of that came from a fall in emissions of hard coal power plants. And we believe that half of this was structural, but the other half was also weather-related. And overall, EU ETS emissions fell by around 3%. And one of our main stories is actually around the phase-out of coal in Europe. And this phase-out is a tale of two types of coal. So Europe's transition from hard coal to renewables, which is actually quite well accelerating. So last year we saw a fall of 9% in 2018. And we are now on a hard coal level of 40% lower than in 2012. And plus, there are a lot of plans announced to phase out hard coal in the European Union. However, there's also the other tail, and that's the one of the transition from lignite to renewables. And unfortunately, this movement is going a bit slower. And unfortunately, also the brown coal is actually the dirtier one. And yeah, this transition is proving much harder. And compared to hard coal, there are less phase-out plans announced. And Dave will tell you more in detail about this later. Another main point of this report is the one about the growth of renewables and a specific renewable type. It's about solar. So we have seen that wind was quite strong in the last years, but solar is coming up in the European Union. So solar additions increased by about 60% to almost 10 gigawatts in 2018. And it outperformed during the summer heat wave when a lot of other fuel types actually struggled. And on top, we have some bold national plans to accelerate solar PV in Europe, and that's quite an interesting story as well. So, and our last main finding is about coal and gas generation costs that rose in 2018 quite tremendously. So, coal price rose by about 15%, and gas prices by 30%, and CO2 prices by about 170%. So consequently, these led to electricity prices of around 45 to 60 euro per megawatt hour in Europe. And this is actually exactly the level around which both wind and solar auctions in Germany cleared. So and this is also quite an interesting story. And with these main key findings, I will hand over to Dave.
Hi, good morning everyone. Thanks for turning up. It's great to see so many people on the webinar. So before I go into the numbers, I just wanted to explain about why we do this study. So we all need up-to-date data to show how the electricity transition in Europe is progressing. Eurostat is the best source of that, but it's always a bit delayed. You can still only get 2016 data. So what we try to do is we piece together the Eurostat data up to 2016 and then give it our best view of what 2017, 2018 would be. So you have a full data set all the way along. This year we've done an awful lot of work trying to get access to ENTSO-E generation data from which comes direct from the TSOs. It's available hourly and very useful data set. If you haven't looked at it, it does come up with a whole load of caveats. So when we piece together this data set, unfortunately, even with that, it's still as much of an art as it is a science to be able to get that up-to-date overview across all the countries. We've then made that data available so you can download it from our website. There's a small Excel file so you can do your own analysis. So please do have a look at it and download it for yourself. So let's look at specifically what happened in 2018. There was a massive increase in renewables. Half was weather related and half was structural. The weather part was hydro. 2017 was one of the lowest, was the lowest hydro generation that we saw this century, and 2018 was just a recovery from that. So if you're from Germany or Austria, you'll be like, well, actually it was really dry in 2018. and same across Nordic, but Southern Europe actually had a wetter than average, and across the whole of Europe it kind of averaged up to an average year for hydro, so correcting from that 2017. And the other half of the renewables is the good news part, which is the structural part, which is that yes, there's more wind, more solar, and a little bit more biomass that's come online. If we weather adjust it, the wind generation should be a little bit higher than that. When you weather adjust it, 17 was quite a windy year compared to 18. So when you weather adjust it and you look at that trend for what happened in 2018 is about the same level of renewable generation that's happened so far this decade. So not an increase, but certainly not a fall off in generation. If we go on to what's happened with fossil, you can see that hard coal and lignite have both fallen. Hard coal generation fell 9%, another year of big falls. Lignite generation fell only 3%. You can see that gas generation also had a big fall that corrected back down from 2017. If you look on the right hand side, you can see on that, it's always easier when I can actually point to the graph, but you can see that light blue chunk at the top, which is the gas generation, and you can see basically that it's corrected back down again in 2018, and where it had been increasing, that was really just a kind of pickup in some of the hydro issues from 2017, where it had been particularly high. So what we're seeing in total is we're seeing gas generation not too unchanged. We're seeing that fall in coal generation from the increase in renewables, and that's a theme that will continue throughout this presentation, and show you evidence around that. The nuclear generation was broadly unchanged. The breakdowns basically swapped from France to Belgium. Net electricity imports into the EU rose very marginally, basically because the Western Balkans was slightly more wet, so there was a bit more coming in there, so that was a small story. And I guess a big story in the overall transition is around what happens with electricity consumption. So there was a very small increase in electricity consumption. Across the EU, it's 0.2%. It's a fourth consecutive year of increases, but it's only a small rise. So if we go on to the next slide, we can see what does all of this mean for carbon intensity. Well, carbon intensity of Europe's electricity fell by 5% during 2018. We collected all this data from electricitymaps.org, who calculate and visualize this in real time, not just across Europe, but across the world. We do suggest you check it out. It's a really useful resource. You can see some of the changes year on year are quite bigger than you think they might be from weather impacts, and we'll talk a little bit more about those weather impacts later on in this presentation. But the absolute numbers show, kind of reinforce what we know as quite a compelling story around I guess the two countries that stick out in that, which is Estonia with its dependence on oil shale, it's having the highest carbon intensity, and then the second highest carbon intensity is Poland with its dependence on coal. So if we go on to the next slide, we can start talking about emissions. So CO2 emissions fell by 5% in the power sector in 2018. By 3% across the whole of the ETS. And what we've done here is we've split the ETS emissions into four components: the lignite power plants, hard coal power plants, the other power plants, which is mostly gas, and then industry. And you can see the change from 2017 to 2018. There's a small fall in lignite, there's a bigger fall in hard coal, there's a correction back down from the gas plants. On the industrial emissions side, we forecast emissions will be unchanged. Although GDP did grow in 2018, the industrial production was pretty weak, so we wouldn't expect an increase in steel or other energy intensive industries coming from that, and therefore flat emissions. So in total, we forecast that EU ETS emissions will be down 3%, that they'll fall to 1,700 million tonnes in 2018. And I guess that's pretty underwhelming. It's broadly in line with the historic trends so far. But in the context of 2017 slight rise, it's really not an overwhelming fall by any stretch of the imagination. What is useful to see is the fall since 2012. It tells the more broader story quite nicely through the CO2 emissions. So we can see that that ETS emissions for lignite and especially hard coal have been falling very quickly. And I guess I just wanted to end up with this slide really to point out how important they are still within the ETS mix within the context of European emissions in total. So still, despite these falls in coal generation, there's still 37% of the emissions within the ETS in 2018 that came from coal power plants, either hard coal or lignite. So if we move on to the next slide and start talking about those falls in coal, and really it's a tale of two stories. So whilst total coal generation fell by 6% in 2018, it's now 30% below 2012, which is great. But there's a big difference between the two coals. So hard coal generation fell by 9% in 2018. It's now 40% lower than it was in 2012. But not only that, but also 3/4 of the remaining hard coal generation in 2018 is under national coal phase outs, assuming that Germany and Spain carry through on their pledges. So you can see the countries in green, which have all made pledges to 2030 and are putting them into action now. You can see Spain and Germany that are in discussions now. So you'll know that Germany have come out with their proposal to phase out coal by 2038. And when those countries are phased out, there's basically a quarter left that at the moment hasn't got a plan in place, and virtually all of that quarter of hard coal left is in Poland. So that the hard coal story in total is a kind of quite a positive story, with obviously Poland left at the bottom trying to figure out its plans on how it deals with its transition. The story around lignite is not quite as rosy. So lignite generation fell 3% in 2018. It's 14% below 2012 levels. But as you can see, that transition is kind of yet to begin. So Germany has come along. The phase out covers both hard coal and lignite for Germany, so that's a huge step forward. It's not clear within Germany how that phase out will be, whether it will be front loading more on the hard coal and back loading the lignite part of the phase out, or whether it will be an equal phase out as that carries through. They're all things to be discussed within Germany. But what really stands out from this chart, I guess, is that the other half of Europe's lignite that isn't Germany is within 6 countries, and all those 6 countries have yet to develop phase-out plans, and those 6 countries are Poland, Czech Republic, Bulgaria, Romania, Greece and Slovenia. So although there's still 22 countries that are burning coal across Europe, which is a lot of countries still burning coal, there's only those really kind of 6 countries, I guess, that stand out here now in terms of needing to develop a plan to transition off of coal. So if we go on to the next slide, we can start talking about why coal is falling. Why is coal falling? Well, renewables is displacing coal. How do we know that? Well, this graph on the left is quite a useful graph to explain this. It shows the change in the electricity mix by country from 2012 to 2018. And it's very clear that where renewables is rising the most, coal is also falling the most. So the 2 biggest countries there are Denmark and the UK, which have seen the biggest growth in renewables. They've also seen the biggest falls in coal. Interestingly, that graph is also very useful to highlight the fact that where renewables are rising the least, coal is also, perhaps unexpectedly, also falling the least. And what I wanted to do really, I guess, is talk about how this relates to the phase out from the previous slide. And when we talk about some of the countries that are phasing out hard coal, a lot of them are the countries on the left-hand side of the graph that have been building renewables pretty well and also have plans to step up their rate of renewables. So across UK, Germany, France, Netherlands, Spain, for example, are all developing plans to be able to replace that coal generation with renewables. So what we've seen so far is a trend we would expect to continue. On the right-hand side, what I've tried to do, actually it's not quite as clear as I wanted that table to be with the killer graphic, but it basically tries to pull out the renewables plans from the 6 countries that we highlighted on the previous page. And what you can see from that is basically the projections from wind power, from Wind Europe and Solar Power Europe on wind and solar. And you can see in the next 5 years' time, Wind Europe are projecting that Poland will only install 0.6 gigawatts of wind capacity, Greece 1.3 gigawatts, Romania half a gigawatt, which are really small amounts to install. Solar Power Europe is showing that Poland will install only 2 gigawatts of solar, and even supersunny Greece has only got 1.6 gigawatts of solar being forecast to be installed in the next 5 years. So for these 6 countries, it's not just about trying to think about the lignite side, it's also trying to work out how that renewables plan is going to help them phase out lignite. So if we move on, I want to change the subject, move on to prices. I'll run through this slide slightly and then I'll hand back over to Elise to talk through some interesting power price developments in 2018. And there was a big change in power prices. Coal price rose 15%, gas price rose 30%, and the carbon permits rose by 170%. And consequently, the cost of running coal and gas plants obviously increased. For coal plants, it's basically risen from 30 euros to 50 euros, for gas plants from 40 euros to 50 euros. This is just for the fuel and carbon prices. So this doesn't include any of the running costs or any other real world costs that will be in here at all. So they're true underestimates. And what we've done besides those coal and gas prices is we've put on the results from the German wind and solar auctions, and you can see through the year that the wind and solar auction prices are basically clearing at a similar level to where coal and gas prices for existing plants are now. And that's a huge step that's been obviously driven a little bit by the falling renewables prices, but largely because of the increase in the cost of burning coal and gas, not only from the carbon price, but also from the fuel price. And then on the right hand side, you can see the changes in the wholesale outturn electricity price. And I guess it's not a surprise that as carbon price rose the most, it was the most carbon intensive electricity system which saw the biggest increases. So Poland saw the biggest power price increase as a result. Okay, back to you, Elise, to continue the subject of prices.
Right. We just wanted to highlight some other events that happened in the power market in 2018, and maybe 2 events worth mentioning. And this is on the one hand side, on the left side, the nuclear outages in Belgium, but also in France. So if you look at a graph on the left side, this which tries to illustrate that, you see the spreads of the day-ahead prices between Belgium and Germany and between France and Germany. And you can see most of the time Germany has lower prices anyway, but especially in the last quarter of 2018, there was some quite high price spikes in Belgium and in France. The reason for this was nuclear outages, partly planned, but partly also not planned due to technical failure. And especially in Belgium, less than 50% of nuclear availability was given, and this led to quite intense price spikes in these countries. And another interesting event that happened was the split of the German, Luxembourg and the Austrian price zone. Before, this was a 1 price zone, and now we got 2, and this happened on the 1st of October in 2018. And on the right graph you can see what happened after this. So you can see on the light blue line is the spread of the Austrian and German they had auction prices, and the dark blue line is the power generation from wind turbines in Germany. And why actually happened the split? Because first of all, there were high redispatch costs in Germany, as we had a lot of congestion in the south, in the southern grid, as there was a missing infrastructure. And also we had a lot of loop flows going from Germany to Poland and Czech Republic, ending up in Austria, and that didn't make those two countries very happy, because they just had some technical efforts to do without any compensation from trade. And for this zone was split. And what's happening now is actually that we have less exports from Germany to Austria, so electricity is not flowing freely anymore as it should have done it before, and we only have a trading capacity of 4.9 gigawatts that is guaranteed at borders. And you can see, especially during times of high wind feed in Germany, we see some big differences in the two prices. So on average, it's about 15% higher prices in Austria compared to Germany, but especially during wind peaks, we have a bigger spreads. This is because the wind electricity now stays more or less in Germany and doesn't flow that freely anymore to the Austrian price zone as it did before. If we go on to the next slide, I'm going to change topic now and come back to our main key findings. And as I told you before, one key finding is around solar generation. As you can see on the left graph, solar wasn't performing extremely great in the last year, so we're now at 4% of Europe's gross electricity production that comes from solar, and this is quite unevenly distributed. So especially in Italy and Germany and Greece, we have a high proportion of 8% solar power, and also Spain and UK are not that bad with 5 and 4%. But the rest of Europe has a very low proportion, especially there's almost no solar generation in Sweden and Finland, like in the northern states, but also in countries that have a lot of sun, like Portugal, for example. And this was quite unfortunate in 2018 because the solar radiation was quite high. I'm going to show you this later on. And but the good news is that the solar installation rate surged by 61% from 5.9 gigawatts to 9.5 gigawatts in 2018. So we're on the highest level since 2013 now. And this was mainly due to module prices that saw a quite big fall of about 29% due to trade restrictions that were relieved in the EU, but also due to a lower world demand because of increasing restrictions in China and trade restrictions in the US. And as you can see on the right part of that right graph, the scenarios for future installation rates are quite different. So if we're in the best case scenario for PV installations, could mean that we have 30 gigawatts of new installation by 2020, and that's actually quite high number, but this very strongly depends on the EU regulations that's coming up, but also on the national implementation plans, as Solar Power Europe was reporting. And another good news is that there are big plans for solar installations coming up. So France announced a 45 gigawatt by 2030, and Italy plans 50 gigawatts by 2030. Spain plans a very ambitious 77 gigawatts by 2030, and also Germany has made plans to increase the installations 4 gigawatts per year in the next 3 years. And Portugal proposed actually to be 80% clean energy, to have 80% clean electricity by 2030, and is on the way to 100% by 2050. So it looks quite sunny for solar PV installations that are coming up. And when you go to the next slide, we can see why this makes totally sense. So if we look at what happened in 2018, we had quite sticky weather conditions. So high pressure regions stayed most in the north, and low pressure regions stayed most in the south. So these regions didn't really mix up that well, so no winds were generated, so weather stayed almost where it is. So in the north it was quite sunny, like above average, and in the south it was the opposite way. But also we had a quite dry summer in the north and a quite wet summer in the south. And what actually happened to do that during that time is that a lot of power production plants struggled, especially nuclear and hard coal, because it was simply too hot in the northern parts of Europe, so that they either had problems to get cooling water, or they couldn't release their hot water into the rivers because they were already hot enough, or that we had just very low river levels in general, and that made hard coal and nuclear struggle. Also, in those areas where we have a lot of wind plants, we unfortunately didn't have so much wind, and this is why those regions would have better relied on solar a little bit more, because they had extraordinary high solar radiation during that time. Hydro was struggling as well because of low water levels, and at the same time demand was quite high, especially in Poland, where there were kind of record levels measured. And we believe, and also other research institutions believe, that this high demand is going to be even higher in the future. So as soon as some cooling technique penetrates more across Europe, we might have higher demand levels in the summer than in winter. So these are all good reasons for solar to be accelerated. And with these words, I give back to Dave.
Hi, thanks. So I've got a final slide to go through. That's some message flick off my screen. Is that okay? It's nothing like keeping people on their feet. Okay, so yeah, so a very quick point here, and then we can move over to questions. There's already lots of questions coming through, so please do pile those questions on. It's great that we already have so many come through. So just on the final slide, electricity consumption, and then talk about what this means, about the future for renewables growth, given the targets that we have within Europe now. So on the left, you can see the change in electricity consumption so far this decade. Across Europe as a whole, there's been a slight fall of 2%. But it's been very different across different regions, and across the further west you go, there's the bigger the fall, and you start going east, and there's been some rises. So the biggest country to fall was the UK, they've fallen by 8% so far this decade. And then as you switch through to the right, you can see the biggest rises are Latvia, if I've got my countries right, 16%, and then Poland at 12%. So there's been some pretty big rises there, but across the context of 8 years, maybe that's not as much as it seems. So 1.5% a year on average, even in the extreme there. However, we do expect that to change. So let me just talk a little bit about the European Commission long-term strategy study that they brought out. They brought this out in November, and what they did was they gave they said, given we now have quite a lot of visibility over 2030, therefore this is what we believe that the total system will look like in 2030, and then put some scenarios for 2050 after that. But on the 2030 scenario, they basically forecast electricity consumption to rise across the whole of Europe by 18%. So whereas we've seen in total it fairly steady, slightly falling this decade, that will switch around as electrification picks up. So that will be driven by transport, electrification of industry, electrification of heat. And the reason why I mention that is it has a big impact on renewables. So if we look at the slide on the graph on the right now, the dates have been cut off at the bottom, so I'll just explain it. At the bottom, on the left, we have in 2010, renewables was 20% of Europe's mix. It rose to 32% by 2018. But in order to get to the renewables targets, according to their modelling of the long-term strategy, that penetration in the electricity mix will have to hit 57%. And on top of that, there's like a kind of like a multiplier effect, which is that also you've got electricity consumption rising quite broadly. So even to stay at 32% of the electricity mix, you need to be building more renewables. Because electricity consumption is increasing. So when you convert that into terawatt hours, you can see that so far this decade, renewables has been rising by 51 terawatt hours. But according to our interpretation of the long-term strategy, and this is kind of reading off slides, they haven't published all the numbers properly. So as a 300-page report that we've kind of tried to kind of interpret into this format, and it basically implying that renewables would have to rise by 94 terawatt hours a year, which is not far off double what we've had so far this decade. So there does need to be a big rise in renewables because of that double effect. There is a third effect as well, which is that if you look at how that's broken down by the three components of renewables, we assume that hydro and all of this is generally not rising in terms of terawatt hours. So the growth has to be picked up by wind, solar, biomass. On the Commission's modelling, they have a big increase in biomass. There's a huge number of questions over how possible, how desirable that is, and also how economic that is now that the costs of solar and wind have come down as much as they have. So if we're assumed to that biomass increase didn't happen, then you would have to have even bigger increases in solar and wind. So the numbers on the right-hand side in the percentages of the electricity mix by 2030, the wind and the solar numbers are explicitly laid out in that long-term strategy: 26% for wind, 11% for solar, and then implied for backwards for biomass for 11%, so an almost doubling of biomass. So I hope that gives like a bit of an overview about the kind of long-term strategy that we're heading on now, and where we have been seeing this big increase in renewables in part because of electrification, that renewables rate will have to rise quite substantially. So that was really where I wanted to end the presentation. Thanks for everyone that's still hanging around. There's still a lot of people on the call, which is great. Let me hand back to Matthias for his moderation. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Dave. And perhaps before we move to the Q&A, also in the report we have one section that is describing very briefly the legal framework as it now stands, that will guide us up to 2030. What Dave just mentioned, the Commission's long-term strategy indeed is taking the 2030 mileposts set now in legislation as the waymarks up to 2050 in their long-term strategy modeling. So an increase in energy efficiency up to 32.5% by 2030, and an increase in renewables share as overall energy consumption of 32% by 2030, which then, as Dave was highlighting, translates to indeed a fairly high percentage of 57% in the electricity sector by 2030. And of course this is very much also a forward planning responsibility on authorities in member states. And in that context it will be very interesting indeed to see what governments now send to Brussels in their integrated national energy and climate plans, which is a new obligation on governments in Europe under this Energy Union governance regulation. So by the end of last year, governments had to submit drafts of these NECPs to Brussels to be evaluated, and then over the course of 2019 these draft plans will be finalized in dialogue with neighbors in the region, in dialogue with the European Commission, and hopefully we will have a level of ambition in those integrative energy and climate plans on renewables, on energy efficiency. Also, we will be seeing how the countries that have not yet seriously looked into phasing down coal will tackle this issue. So these NECPs will be a very important reference point throughout 2019 and how they evolve. Perhaps a last point that links to the discussion on coal and where does coal stand and where does it might stand in the future. There have been important decisions as part of the electricity market design legislation, and probably the most important one is the decision of the EU legislator to limit the future ability of governments to subsidize coal in capacity markets. So effectively the decision taken says that as of entry into force of the new electricity market regulation, i.e. on the 1st of January 2020, it will not be allowed to subsidize new coal plant in capacity markets, whereas for existing capacity mechanisms, the ability to give capacity payments to coal, unmitigated coal generation, needs to be stopped by July 2025. There is a grandfathering clause that particularly Poland will very likely use, but by and large the headline message there is that it will become more difficult in the future to keep coal in the market despite economics eroding, looking into the future due to rising carbon prices, etc. So some of the stories we're already seeing in this year's report. So this, I'll keep it there. And Alice, you want to facilitate the Q&A part?
Exactly, that's what I'm going to do. So please excuse any mispronunciation of names. But I would just say we start as the questions were coming in, and if we're not getting finished, so we'll probably just address your questions by email. If you may leave your email address later on, so that we can get back to these questions. So Katrin Glastra is interested in the kind and the origin of the imports that we can see on slide 3. Can we go back to slide 3, please? Yes. So.
Yeah. So if I pick that one up. So yeah, there's a bit of an increase from some countries in Western Balkans and from the Eastern Europe that's connected via Russia, via Ukraine. In there, they're not big trends. They're kind of going up and down every year. There's no kind of big changes as far as structural changes as far as I'm aware. So that's just, in my opinion, just noise. It's a bit of a correction up because they had a dry year in 2017, so they had more hydro to be able to export in 2018. Within the report, there's I made the lady at Agora do this hugely complex map of all the interconnector flows between all the countries. It's got the 2018 and the change versus 2017. So within the report, it's got all the flows between every country in there. So do check that out if you want to know more, and ask if you want to know any more on that. There's quite a few clarification questions in here. I don't know if, Elise, if it's okay if I just run through 2 or 3 clarification questions very quickly on here, and then we can then you can pick out some other ones to actually spend a bit of time moderating on, and we'll talk about more. Marta asked, is the prices for households or industry, is it all with taxes? No, the prices that we put on there were only the wholesale prices. We haven't tried to look at household or industry prices. Within the report, there's a link to the latest Commission numbers that looks at the prices for household industry, and they published them about 4 weeks ago for 2017 for every country. So that is quite interesting reading. Simon asked, why is hydro completely excluded? It's not completely excluded. We ignored it in one graph when we're talking about the structural increases, because it's not structurally increasing to the same extent as wind, solar, biomass. So we definitely haven't ignored it within the renewables. When we talk about the percentages, that is including hydro within that. Ivo, do you have a breakdown of who is investing in RES? The utilities, cooperatives, own consumptionists? I'm afraid not. BNEF, Bloomberg New Energy Finance, do quite a lot on that. So it's worth checking out their report. There's a link in our report to the BNEF latest numbers that came out in January for investment into renewables. So I'd recommend going there. And just one other point before I hand back to Elise. Elise asked, when you talk about renewables, are you considering only wind and solar, or biomass and biogas as well? So we've tried to break down the renewables as much as possible, so it's been clear what we are talking about and when we are talking about it. We have put biomass in there, and that biomass is electricity generation, which includes all the forms of biomass, including biogas, electricity generation. So the numbers are in there. There's some points pulled out in there about some of the desirability and impacts on there, and linking through to other people's work on biomass if you want to read more. Okay, Elise, sorry.
Peter de Poos is interested in, he's coming from E3G and is interested in consumption increase. So why did it go up, and shouldn't it go down under EED?
Yeah, it's always a question that people are interested in asking. Neil's asked the same question as well, so that's surprising that actually asking the opposite, sorry, which is surprising that it's falling when you've got electrification. So the true answer is that we have very little breakdown of that electricity consumption and transparency about why that's happened. So, for example, the UK has been falling a lot more rapidly than any other country, and when we look at why the UK has been falling, it's like, well, that makes sense. Well, that makes sense. It's like, well, there are also factors that should make sense in other countries where it isn't falling. So, well, why is this happening as it is? So it's very difficult to be able to explain from the data that we have. I wish I had a better answer to that. In terms of the electrification side and why it's not increasing more, it's like the simple answer to that is that it just hasn't picked up yet. So if you look at the penetration of electric vehicles now, okay, the sales rate is growing up quite nicely, but the penetration is still very low. If you look at the plans around electrification of heat, for example, they're kind of plans that will come through in terms of, but then if you look at heat pumps and the sales of heat pumps, they are picking up, but they're not reaching that huge deployment that we would hope to reach, that people are talking about reaching. So we're in this kind of in-between world at the moment, where you've got energy efficiency perhaps putting electricity demands down a little bit, not as much as maybe you would hope for it to, but for electrification yet to actually lead to some big increases in electricity demand. I hope that's a little clearer. It's a really hard subject, and it would be great to see some more data out there.
And Neil Grant from Imperial College London has a question that is kind of related to that, because he was surprised to see that much of Western Europe has falling electricity consumption. What
yeah,
is
no,
the cause for this?
Yeah, and that was what I just covered really, is about the electrification is yet to pick up. Yeah.
Yeah. And another one from Peter from E3G. So EC seems to have a more pessimistic assessment of solar growth compared to earlier optimistic scenarios. What are the main factors behind the difference?
So if you look at how they kind of put their 2050 the long-term strategy together, they say this is the amount of electricity that we've got to get to that's renewables, and then they have a breakdown of that between wind, solar and biomass. So within their modelling, they've assumed that growth in biomass will continue. So it's not going towards solar, and they've obviously said there's going to be a big increase in wind, which basically is meant that solar's it's still got a huge increase, but maybe it's not as big as you might expect it to be. That's not to say it couldn't be that big, especially in context like we were highlighting that all that biomass growth actually genuinely happen.
I believe, Dave, to add, we have not yet seen publication of the full data sets underpinning the long-term strategy. And of course, as soon as we have those figures, we can try to understand a bit better some of the underlying assumptions that come to those trends in the latest Commission modeling.
Yeah, just to say so very quickly, they do put a number in for 2030. They say European solar will rise to 320 gigawatts by 2030. So it's not small ambitions for solar for sure.
Lisa Fischer asks if we're looking into enabling factors like progress on installing storage, smart grids, or grid expansion, as this could be useful too. So in this report, we actually didn't.
Yeah.
We've tried to keep it to volumes to be able to relate to emissions, to be able to relate to the kind of volumetric side rather than the how do you keep the lights on and the other investment that you need around that. And we always keep meaning to put more in there, and we certainly will look at that next year and on what else there is to track on that. It's a critical part of the electricity transition for sure.
Agora Nomdideu. Do you think that France will reach the renewables target stated in their PP to 2030? We have seen a lot of public opposition in the past and other obstacles for development. What do you think is coming up there in the years to come?
I don't have all the answers. I have no idea.
I mean, as it's highlighted, they are planning to do, so France is planning to do significantly more PV. And so there is clearly an increase in ambition. How let's say the economic context for renewables deployment in France will develop, of course, also depends on how they are going to come down on the future of nuclear and the investments that might be needed in the French nuclear fleet. And this is still a moving picture, as you know, so it's a bit like, yeah, there's no hard judgment I have on this, except that we know that France is planning much more ambitiously now on solar PV in particular. As regards offshore, offshore is, we have seen tremendous cost reductions in the past years, and offshore clearly is increasingly making a contribution to the renewables deployment in Europe. Some of the most interesting developments I'm seeing is, for instance, in Poland. Poland is now seriously looking into developing some offshore capacity, which has not been in the political debate if you are looking 2 years back. So solar is offshore wind is increasingly coming into the picture.
Yeah, and what's I do look at Wind Europe's website. They've got a lot of really interesting analysis on there. In October, they launched their forecasts of wind over the coming years, 2022, and because offshore has quite long time scales with the planning for it. You can see what they can see with quite a lot of certainty, that pipeline for offshore coming through, and it's really encouraging that that's building up in the way that it is. And basically, the point that they're making within that is to try to keep the pressure on the governments for that regulatory framework to be able to keep that pipeline, keep pushing through because of the long lead times and the massive investments needed for these. You do need that level of certainty to keep that level of investment up.
There is new pushing and incentivizing from the European level, specifically also for offshore, through a new pot of funding that will be made available for what they call renewable energy projects of European interest, which particularly could be deployed to developing offshore and the necessary infrastructure for offshore wind parks.
Elion Gerguri has, who's coming from Balkan Green Foundation, has a question that we cannot really answer with this report, but it concerns Kosovo, which has around 270 sunny days throughout the year, but only 7 megawatts installed solar capacity. How can this capacity be accelerated besides using attractive feed-in tariffs?
It's really interesting about, like, in the EU, just about how many different ways solar's coming online. So so a lot of the feed-in tariffs have now been replaced with auctions for the largest projects. But a lot of the growth now, there's growth coming from unsubsidized wholesale projects that are selling direct into the market. There's a huge pickup in corporate PPAs. Where companies are either installing solar directly themselves or doing it via power purchase agreements. And then with the changes in market design that are coming along, there's a lot more opportunities for households to be able to benefit directly from installing solar. So there's a whole way, numerous ways that growth is happening across Europe, which means that it should be quite sustainable because it's not reliable one specific thing. Matthias, I don't know if you want to talk about some of the market design changes that have really helped solar.
I wanted to specifically on the Kosovo question. As Agora, we are also part of a network with Southeast European countries, including 6 countries from the Western Balkan. In that context, if you go to our website, you see it's called SE3TNet, and there's quite some information on activities in the region, including some analysis on potential and how it could be developed, and some new forthcoming studies that you might be interested in. One specifically will look at the possibility of low-cost renewables development in countries in the region, and I'm aware that one colleague has contributed a few months back to a study specifically on Kosovo, on how to scale renewables in Kosovo in the specific context there. I believe it was by GIZ and German Watch, this publication where he contributed a chapter on renewables.
Maybe a last quick question from Anderson Komenan. He would like to know how much the EU coal electricity reduction would positively affect CO2 emissions.
So I love the number 37%. 37% is the amount of emissions in the ETS that come from coal. Across Europe as a whole for greenhouse gases, I think it's around 15% for 2018 when we get the final numbers through. So coal is a huge amount of the overall mix across. So coal generation is still a huge amount of input into CO2 emissions across Europe. And just the speed at which they're falling is incredible. So for all of coal, 30% down since 2012 is pretty incredible. And really how quickly that develops, it just comes back to how quickly it's displaced by new renewables coming online. So that's the reason why throughout this report we've tried to make the link from hard coal lignite into renewables, because that the whole idea that you're transitioning away from coal is you're transitioning towards renewables, and I think now that's the evidence is there that has been happening, and it's happening pretty well. So it's really having that focus, the kind of carrot, as it were, on the renewables, while still taking a bit of a stick to coal to make sure that has a plan to come off, and it's not hanging around too much like a bad smell, as it were. So because there's progress on both those issues of phase out plans for coal, of building the renewables, it feels like those CO2 emissions should keep falling pretty aggressively within the power sector. And certainly Germany's coal phase out is only going to help that.
We have time for another question. So the EU plan is 37% wind and solar by 2030, says Vincent Shriki, and that assumes an enormous flexibility in the system, so to deal with days of low wind and solar and less fossil fuel plants at the same time. is a problem. So how are we going to respond to this with on-off capabilities?
Every year we put the update from the system operators. So ENTSO is the agglomeration of system operators, and basically they have a winter review, they have a summer review, and in our report we basically write up their paragraph summary from what happened in winter and summer across security, across the electricity system, and across the last winter, across the last summer. The only issue that they've really been concerned at is an issue around Kosovo and Serbia and some of the frequency fluctuations there that have been impacting. And they've made a big deal about that. Some of the frequency fluctuations can be felt as far north as northern Germany. But ignoring that, they haven't so far highlighted anything along there. So sure, there will be problems along the way. No one's pretending there's not going to be problems. But at the moment, those problems are pretty well contained.
But perhaps to add and to expand a bit, so there's a lot in the so the question, I believe, goes to an important point. If you're increasing the share of renewables, particularly variable renewables, the power system needs to become more flexible. This is a technical challenge, it's a management challenge. It can be done. Some countries are already today showing that you can do this. What is important now is that we have an EU framework legislation in place that is steering us towards greater power system flexibility. We have the new electricity market design legislation that will strengthen short-term market functioning. So there will be, in the software of the markets, there will be greater flexibility also for variable renewables to penetrate the markets, to be balanced via the markets. We will have more space for demand-side flexibility, etc. So there is a lot happening now that will progressively be implemented by governments across Europe that will strengthen and beef up power system flexibility. In addition, we have the targets set at EU level that will be broken down to national targets in these integrated national energy and climate plans. And of course, the system responsible entities, the TSOs at national level, will start the forward planning and how to accommodate rising shares of renewables in the system. In addition, of course, you do have on a continuous basis security of supply monitoring. So in case that predictions are there could be a problem, measures can be taken well in advance. So in a nutshell, I think yes, there is an issue. Power system flexibility needs to be increased, but by and large, countries in Europe are well on track of managing this challenge. Yeah. And now we stop? Okay. So I'm getting signs that we should stop. There are a few questions which I believe we didn't manage to reply to. Let me just say thank you for you attending this webinar. It will be put on our website to watch later on as well. Many thanks for your active participation. I hope you enjoyed it as much as we did. If you perhaps service to us and to ourselves, if you wish to keep up to date with events and publications, please don't fail to register to our respective newsletters of Sandbag and Agora. We are not spamming you with mailings, but we just keep you up to date on important activities. And thanks to Dave, thanks to Alice, and thanks to Nicola and all colleagues here supporting us from the technical side. See you again in wherever, whenever, online or offline, live. It was a pleasure to have this webinar. Bye-bye from Brighton and Berlin.
Thank you.